And if there is one thing that gets investors nervous, if we're already talking economy and markets, it is political controversy and uncertainty. So how are this week's events likely to impact investors? We're talking about the Middle East, uncertainty seemingly constant in this part of the world, and an already volatile situation between Israel and Iran over Syria and over the nuclear deal. Now a second day of protests from Israel to the West Bank and Gaza.
But throughout peaks of conflict, Israeli tech has flourished in recent years. We've seen major buyouts of companies like Mobileye and venture capital rising over the past 3 years. We saw a record $4.7 billion in 2017. Well, for more on this, let's go to New York and speak with Steve Schoenfeld. He's the founder and chief investment officer of BlueStar Indexes. And Steve, let me just start. Everywhere investors are always nervous about, as I said, political controversy, about political violence, instability. Should investors be nervous about what's happening now in this region?
Well, there's been a long history of concern about geopolitical risks, but the reality in Israel is that Israel's economy has never been stronger, and its stock market, especially Israeli tech stocks, have never performed better. This year to date, Israeli tech stocks, as measured by BlueStar's Israel Tech Index, are up 7%. After last year's incredible 28% rise. And so it's very important to separate what you see on the headlines with the fundamentals of the economy and the incredible resilience of Israeli companies.
Well, Stephen, you would think that conflict and just a taste of what we mentioned from the Iran deal seemingly blowing up to the last 2 days of violence, you would think that would scare off investors over time. Why doesn't it?
Well, Nurit, investors who look for opportunity and look for world-beating technology would be wise to look to Israel. You have leading Israeli companies in almost all the tech fields that are changing the world for the better, whether it's 3D printing, autonomous driving, software, hardware, Internet of Things, and including agri-tech and clean tech. And so investors are very rational. They see how these companies are leaders in their field, and they want to put their money to work. It was just yesterday that our tech index, which is tracked by a NYSE-listed ETF, hit an all-time high. And so it's really important for investors to make that distinction.
Stephen, if I look back over the past of this century, say in the Israeli economy, the one blip I do see is in the Second Lebanon War. There was a drop in Israeli GDP. We did see some drop in investment. We haven't seen that level of violence. Is there a risk if we really go, as some fear over the Iran situation, to that level of perhaps actual war conflict?
So historically, and we've done a lot of research around this, when there is an extended conflict, such as there was in the summer of 2006, and there's been in other periods of Israel's history, where the reserves are called up and employees are losing some of their staff to war, you do see some temporary dips. But historically, those dips are buying opportunities. People forget that Israel has a very robust financial system of its own, and if foreigners get scared because of risks to Israel, Israeli domestic investors will usually seek out value. So of course, one shouldn't be sanguine about what could happen if a conflict heats up with Iran, but as we just saw last week, Israel knows what it's doing in keeping it clear on what its red lines are, and I've never been more confident about Israel's economy than at the present.
Well, Steve, let's dig a little deeper in what you call that resiliency of the economy, because right now, if people in the U.S. and including investors are seeing on their TV screens those images from the Gaza border, in most countries, that would be a warning sign for investors. Why has Israel been able to immunize itself against the kind of pictures, the fear that pictures like these normally drive in the heart of investors?
It's a great question. And the short answer is, unfortunately, Israelis have gotten used to this, whether it was during the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2002, where the violence literally was hitting the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, or the last three hot conflicts with Gaza, most recently the summer of 2014, Israeli companies understand how to operate with this. Ben Gurion Airport was partly shut for 2 days, but now Israel has overflow airports. if, God forbid, the port in Ashdod is threatened, then Israel will arrange its exports to go out of Haifa. And so the Israeli population is resilient, and that makes Israeli companies resilient. Foreign investors have also gotten used to it. You mentioned the Lebanon War of 2006. Of course, it was a scary time for Israel's north, but let's not forget that same exact summer was when Warren Buffett made his first ever investment outside of the U.S. into Teflon Industries, which is based in the north. And so smart money understands where value is.
Stephen, so we're talking about Israel until now, which is really a very small part of the greater Middle East, and the same situation in the greater Middle East in terms of conflict. Certainly no shortage of stability across this region. Has that impacted investors in an extremely different way than the case in Israel you described?
So certainly when the Palestinians choose the path of conflict instead of the path of reconciliation, it doesn't help stocks that are listed on the Nablus stock exchange. Jordan has had its challenges, but just 1,000 miles to the east, you have the Gulf markets, which, even though they face a threat of a resurgent Iran, are doing pretty well. So investors can discriminate. I don't believe they look at all Middle East countries in isolation. Lebanon has a very different situation, for example, than Egypt does, and investors understand how to make that distinction.
Well, that's because so you look at investments and not just Israel. Price of oil, for example, do you think that that's a risk now for the general market? So the gradual rising price of oil has been actually a net positive. The question is, at what point does it turn negative? So you've seen recovery in energy stocks. I think if we get to $85 or $90 a barrel, we could have problems. I don't see an immediate situation that could create that. The only big risk that could have oil go up that much in the short term would be if Venezuelan oil goes completely offline and off the market.
All right, Steve Schoenfeld in our studios in New York. Some insight on the Middle East. Not all bad for investors, despite everything we have heard over the last couple of days in terms of the reality on the ground.